The screen trembles with grainy black and white footage of a crumbling southern mansion, vines crawling like veins up its pillars. The sound of cicadas grows unbearable, cut by the faint cry of a newborn child. Then silence. Narrator, voice low, deliberate. In 1841, on a fading stretch of land outside Selma, Alabama, stood the Dandridge Plantation. Its name was erased from county maps, its ledgers burned, its graves unmarked. Yet the locals whispered of its mistress, Mary Eloise Dandridge, a widow draped in black lace, who ruled the house with a quiet smile and an iron hand. Her secret was not in her wealth, nor her power, but in the reward she granted to her most loyal slave. Not freedom, not money, but a single night in her bed. Thunder crashes. The screen fades into black. They called it an honor. They called it devotion. But what she left behind was corruption so deep, so vile, that generations would bleed for her indulgence. The camera pans across rusted gates. An iron lock dangles, broken, as if forced open decades ago. The road ahead is swallowed by kudzu. The Dandridge house rose like a mausoleum over the Alabama fields. Built in 1820, it was a masterpiece of Southern Gothic ambition. 12 columns, black oak staircases, and portraits painted in oils so dark they seemed alive. But every grandeur concealed a debt. The widow inherited the land after her husband's death from fever. She was 34, childless, and determined that no man would dictate her future. Neighbors called her eccentric. Ministers called her ungodly. Yet no one challenged her, not while her cotton empire fattened the county's purse. The slaves whispered she walked barefoot through the fields at night, her gown trailing like smoke. That she touched their children's heads, whispering promises. That her hunger was not just for power, but for something forbidden, something that blurred the boundaries of ownership and flesh. And in the summer of 1841, she made her selection. The sound of insects swells again. The frame closes on the face of a young man, recreated in shadow, his eyes downcast, his shoulders tense. He was called Josiah. Strong, obedient, untouched by punishment. The widow watched him for months, marking his movements, testing his loyalty. Each harvest, each prayer, each bowed head drew her closer. One evening, she called him to the big house. The servants watched from the shadows, their breath caught in their throats. Josiah entered her chambers, where candles burned low and curtains were drawn tight. The door shut, and no sound followed. The next morning, he emerged, eyes hollow, steps unsteady. No one dared speak of what had happened. But that night would set into motion horrors that would unravel the plantation, the town, and every soul bound to the Dandridge name. The camera pulls back. A baby's cry cuts across the silence once more. By the winter of 1842, the widow bore a child. The town was told the infant belonged to a distant cousin, taken in from tragedy. But the slaves knew the truth. They had seen Josiah summoned again and again. They had heard the footsteps, the soft cries, the silence that followed. The baby's skin was pale, but his eyes black as coal. He wailed at night with a voice that shook the rafters. The housemaids whispered that when the widow nursed him, her face grew pallid, as though life itself were draining into the infant's mouth. The church demanded answers. Reverend Calhoun came to the house, his Bible trembling in his hands. But when the widow greeted him, smiling with the child swaddled at her breast, the words turned to ash in his throat. He left without preaching, and from that day, the church bell seemed to toll softer, as though even God would not ring in judgment. The town of Selma pretended not to see. They needed her cotton, her money, her favors. Men who whispered in saloons fell silent when she entered. Women who hissed behind lace fans bowed their heads when she passed. And yet, every family carried dread. Children were warned never to wander near the Dandridge gates. Newlyweds were told to steer their wagons clear of the fields at dusk. For the widow was said to have begun choosing others, not just Josiah. Young men disappeared, their names erased, their absence explained away by lies that never settled right. At night, the slaves in the quarters locked their doors with chains of tin and prayer. But still her shadow stretched long, reaching for them, bending them to her will. And the town, complicit, silent, held its breath. By 1843, children of curious lineage began to appear. Some fair, some dark, all with eyes too knowing for their years. The widow did not keep them all. Some she gave away, to neighbors, to churches, to an orphanage she funded herself. That orphanage still stands today, its windows boarded, its halls empty. They say if you walk inside, you can hear the faint reciting of scripture, children's voices overlapping, trembling. No records list those children's names. No graves mark where they were buried. Yet families across Alabama whispered of infants arriving at their doorsteps, bearing the mark of Dandridge blood, an unsettling mix of privilege and bondage, innocence and corruption. And through it all, the widow never spoke of her choices. She moved through town draped in black, her lips pale, her eyes burning with secrets that curdled every tongue that dared to gossip. By 1845, the church could no longer bear it. Reverend Calhoun broke his silence in a sermon that would never be forgotten. He cried that the widow's house was unholy ground, a place where flesh and power mingled in defiance of heaven. But his words shook the town like an earthquake. Families stormed from the pews. Some demanded the widow be condemned. Others begged silence, fearing loss of their livelihoods. That night, the Reverend's house burned to the ground. He and his wife were found clutching each other's charred remains. The next Sunday, the church bell did not ring. It never rang again. By the late 1840s, the plantation swarmed with children. Some ran through the fields, their laughter shrill. Others stood silent in corners, staring with eyes that pierced bone. The slaves whispered they were not children at all, that something older looked out through them. The widow treated them as heirs, teaching them to read, to write, to manage accounts. They called her mother and obeyed her every word. But the other children of Selma, they vanished. One by one, families searched the woods, the rivers, the abandoned cabins. No trace. Rumors swelled that the Dandridge brood had taken them, lured them through the gates with whispers and games, only for them to never return. Parents kept their children inside after sunset. Doors were bolted, windows nailed shut, but the sound of small fists tapping at the glass was said to echo through the night. The Dandridge bloodline began to spread through Alabama, quietly, inherited through children raised in silence. They grew into adults who married, who birthed their own. Generations branched outward, threading corruption into the veins of the South. And yet, none spoke of their origin. Families erased the years between 1841 and 1850 from their Bibles. Photographs were burned, journals destroyed. But some records slipped through, scraps of letters, old receipts, fragments of testimony written by trembling hands. Enough to prove that Selma carried a hidden wound. And in every generation, whispers returned. Of pale children with dark eyes, of laughter that curdled milk, of women who walked barefoot through fields under the moonlight. When the Civil War reached Alabama, Union soldiers marched toward Selma. The Dandridge plantation was marked for burning. Yet when the men reached its gates, they refused to enter. Accounts differ. Some claim the horses reared and bolted. Others swore they heard voices calling from the fields, children's voices begging to be let in. The soldiers torched the fields but left the house untouched. Days later, those same soldiers were found along the riverbanks, their throats slit, their faces pale as though drained of blood. The war moved on. The Dandridge house remained. After the birth of the widow's second child, Josiah, the slave who had been her first chosen, vanished. The quarters searched, the fields searched, the river dragged. No trace. Some whispered he had been given freedom, paid off, sent far from Selma. But the slaves knew the truth. They had seen him, night after night, summoned to her chambers, his shoulders sagging, his eyes lifeless. Then silence. The housemaids claimed his shadow lingered, walking the upper floors after midnight. One swore she heard his voice praying through the walls, pleading for mercy that never came. Josiah's disappearance was never recorded in any ledger. His name was scratched out, leaving only blank parchment where he once lived. It was as though he had been swallowed by the house itself. By 1850, the widow was no longer seen in church, nor in town. Her skin grew pale, her hair streaked white, yet she walked the halls with the energy of a girl. Servants whispered of rituals, that she lined her bed with salt, that she wrote names in ash on her mirrors, that her children gathered around her in circles, chanting words no one recognized. The townsfolk said the plantation bell rang at midnight, though no one pulled its rope. Its toll echoed through the valley 7 times every night. It was no longer scandal. It was terror, and the county records stopped mentioning her altogether. In 1852, grown orphans who had been given away years before began to return. Young men and women, blank-eyed, arriving on horseback, barefoot, or stumbling through fields as if drawn by some invisible tether. They spoke little. They smiled rarely. But they gathered around the widow, kneeling, calling her mother. Neighbors reported seeing dozens of figures in black, standing motionless in her fields under the moonlight. Some claimed they moved like one body, heads turning, arms raising, as though puppet by a single will. Selma grew restless. Families began to flee. But leaving was not so simple. Some never reached the next town. Wagons overturned, horses bolted, travelers found dead on the roadside. Eyes wide, mouths filled with dirt, as though the earth itself had swallowed their final breath. In 1854, a fever swept Selma, but only the children fell ill. One by one, they wasted a bone. Physicians bled them, dosed them, prayed over them. Nothing. And then, in a wave as sudden as it came, the sickness stopped. Every surviving child awoke the same night, walked to their windows, and stared toward the Dandridge plantation. Witnesses swore their pupils turned black as coal. The following morning, most remembered nothing. But some carried scars, marks on their arms like bite wounds, arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. Parents whispered of curses, of bargains, of blood debts no one dared admit aloud. The town was unraveling, one child at a time. After the war, the Dandridge fields lay fallow. Slavery was abolished, the cotton empire shattered. Yet the widow remained. Strangers traveling the road claimed to see pale women tending the grounds, though no crops grew. Black-eyed children wandering the porches, though no laughter rang. The freed slaves refused to return, even for pay. They spoke of promises broken, of blood soaked into soil too deep to cleanse. And yet, census takers still marked inhabitants at the Dandridge place. A household that grew, year after year, in numbers no one could quite confirm. Selma, already bruised by war, turned its gaze elsewhere, and the house was left to rot in its secrecy. Mary Eloise Dandridge died in 1871, or so the county claimed. Her body was buried in a marble tomb on the plantation grounds. But gravediggers swore the casket was too light. Some said it was empty. Others whispered they heard scratching inside, long after the earth was sealed. Her children dressed in mourning and walked behind the coffin, their faces serene, unblinking. Not one shed a tear. And yet, years later, travelers swore they saw the widow walking the balcony at dusk, her gown trailing, her hands reaching outward. The dead do not always rest. Not when their sins have taken root in the living. After her death, the plantation should have fallen into ruin. But it did not. Her children, those born of secrecy, of reward, of shadow, kept the house alive. They intermarried quietly, spreading into towns, cities, congregations. Their features disguised by time, their lineage hidden in plain sight. But witnesses noticed them. Eyes too dark, smiles too knowing. Families who never seemed to age. Churches where whispers fell silent at their arrival. The Dandridge name faded. But the blood survived. In Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, threading itself into the fabric of a nation that never dared ask whose hands held the needle. In 1894, the orphanage the widow had funded caught fire. It burned through the night, its timbers collapsing, its children screaming. Yet when rescuers broke through, no bodies were found. Every child had vanished. The charred walls were covered in symbols carved deep into the wood. Circles, crosses, spirals that turned upon themselves like hungry mouths. The orphanage was abandoned, left to the weeds. But to this day, travelers swear they hear singing inside, children's voices rising and falling, as though a hymn were being sung backward. By the turn of the 20th century, the Dandridge house still stood, though barely. Locals said vines swallowed its walls, roots cracked its foundations, yet somehow it endured. Until 1911. That year, a storm swept through Selma, tearing roofs and uprooting trees. When it cleared, the Dandridge plantation was gone. Not destroyed, gone. The fields stretched empty, grass and kudzu where once the 12 columns rose. No rubble, no timbers, no stone, just earth. Some said the house had sunk into the ground, taking its inhabitants with it. Others swore it had been reclaimed, not by God, but by something older, something that does not leave ruins behind. The name Dandridge disappeared from the county books entirely. Final shot, modern-day Selma. Cracked roads, rusted fences, the air heavy with cicadas. The camera pushes into an empty field where nothing grows. Then, faintly, a child's laugh echoes. Narrator, closing, voice like a warning. History buried the Dandridge plantation. The town silenced itself. Families destroyed their records. But blood remembers what paper forgets. Even now, descendants walk among us. Unmarked, unspoken, unknown. Their eyes may be lighter, their smiles more human, their names changed 100 times. But somewhere, in every generation, the shadow stirs. And when it does, it remembers the bargain first struck in 1841, when a widow gave her slave not freedom, not gold, but a night in her bed. And the children of that night never stopped multiplying. The screen fades to black. Only the sound of cicadas remains. Then silence.